my years since then, my husband and I met there. We lived in Maryland and New Jersey for a brief stint. We also lived a little bit in Northern Illinois. But mostly we've been in Iowa. So I feel like I'm an Iowan at this point. So I, as I said, I grew up on a farm in Missouri, a cattle farm. So we didn't have row crops or anything. It was just beef cattle. And then I was at Grinnell. I majored in anthropology. I wasn't thinking about agriculture really at all at that point. And it wasn't until years later, we were living in Northern Illinois and our daughters were very young and we would go to this little pumpkin patch, apple orchard, you pick kind of place. And I'd never been to a farm like that. It's like, I just wouldn't go march around on somebody's farm where I grew up. That would be really weird. So I was like, gosh, this is strange. And they had all this old equipment and kids were climbing on the equipment. And I was like, given sort of the trajectory of agriculture and as farms get bigger and bigger, I was like, this is a really interesting way that a small farm stays profitable. They have these, different kind of activities. You actually bring people to the farm. Now I know it's called agritourism and it's a big thing, but at the time it was totally new to me. And so I went back to graduate school in 2007 at the University of Iowa and continuing in anthropology. And I was interested in sort of some kind of small farming and how small farmers were remaining viable. And local food was heating up at the time. I had heard of community-supported agriculture about that time, but I hadn't interacted with it a lot. And so that kind of became my research area. So I did ethnographic research with local food farmers in Iowa. I have been doing it now since 2007, including in some interviews here on this farm many years ago. Talking to people about, my approach is I want to understand kind of what day-to-day life looks like and what the whole world of local food farming look like. So, I worked on farms, I volunteered, I interviewed people, I went to lots of farm conferences and farm events to kind of understand what the context and what were people learning about. And so that took me through my PhD dissertation. I finished up in 2014. And then, interestingly, this job in public health was open at the University of Iowa that was focused on agricultural safety and health. And I thought, that was, again, a topic I hadn't thought a whole lot about at the time. But they needed someone who understood the daily practice of agriculture. It was less about I work now with a lot of industrial hygienists and toxicologists, and I'm kind of this oddball and social scientist with a bunch of science-focused people. But they really needed somebody who knew what farming was about and who had connections in the state with farmers. So now a lot of my work, I'm a faculty member, so I teach classes and I'm still doing research on local food. I've got a project on biodiversity happening right now. But I'm also doing a lot of education and outreach about farm safety. And so the health angle of things is that farming is a really dangerous job. So rates of occupational fatalities are higher in agriculture than in any other industry in Iowa. So I'm looking at that tractor and I'm glad to see there's a roll bar on it and I see hearing protection and I hope whoever runs it always has their seatbelt on when they get on there with the roll bar. So that's my PSA, I guess, for the day about operating. Yeah.
So is there more accidents with, so sometimes when it's like an immigrant farm, I guess you would call it, is there more accidents there or with just a regular farm with more equipment?
So a small farm versus sort of a larger scale?
And you said like with maybe just particularly like migrant farmers. Or
yeah. Oh, got it. That's a good question. So the one challenge with figuring out these numbers is that it's hard to keep track of accidents like this, particularly among migrant populations. They're hard to reach. They're vulnerable and somewhat invisible population. So understanding those numbers are challenging. The organizations that keep occupational injury and fatality surveillance, they're really hardcore about making sure that an accident happens at work. And when you're on a farm, it's also usually your home.
Right.
So a lot of times people are doing work like mowing ditches, right? And they turn their tractor over. And then it's like, is that a production? Is that an occupational fatality or not? For me, it's totally farm related. I think we should be inclusive, but it often doesn't get captured in the statistics. So I guess to answer your question, we know a lot more about the incidents that happen they're clearly work-related, and those are usually on sort of standard, sort of traditional, whatever you want to call it, family-operated farms. Incidents among migrant and seasonal workers are really hard to track because they're a hard population to keep track of. There are some programs for particularly related to pesticides training, heat exposure training that happen throughout the Midwest with migrant and seasonal farm workers. If you guys have come across Proteus at all, that's a nonprofit that does a lot of great work with migrant and seasonal farm workers, mostly in the Midwest. And so they actually do a lot to kind of just understand the lay of the land of that population. But the numbers we have are not great. So that's not a very direct answer to your question. It's hard to know.
Most of what you hear about is sort of conventional farms,
Right.
big machines, grain bins.
Machinery and livestock are friends out there. Not those friends in particular. Cattle are a bit worse, but are tend to be the major causes of the big injuries. And then grain bin incidents are always on the increase. The more grain we grow, the bigger the containers, the bigger the bins we put it all in, and then the more risky it is if you're going into them. And then we also are seeing more incidents related to manure pits under confinement buildings. So hydrogen sulfide gets trapped under all that manure. You got an 8-foot pit full of hog poop, and underneath it, all this hydrogen sulfide is trapped. And then when they agitate the manure before they pump it out, that releases all that hydrogen sulfide. So if it's not a well-ventilated area, if you get hit with a big exposure of hydrogen sulfide, it just takes you out. It's called the knockdown effect. People just drop, and it shuts down your respiratory system, and it kills them really quickly. It's horrifying. And those fatalities are really awful because what tends to happen is you've got 2 or 3 people say, oh, they cleaned out the pit, somebody dropped something in there, they got to go do a repair, somebody goes down in the pit to do it, they get into a pocket of hydrogen sulfide, they collapse. What does the guy up on top do? He goes in after him, and then you have multiple fatalities. So these are things that are happening more and more often. So farming's also great and really good for you, but it can be really dangerous. So.
I have another question. So, is there one time of year that's more busy, I guess you would say, than others? In like a sense that farming wise?
Yeah, there's definitely a rhythm to it. And in the Midwest, planting and harvest are the 2 intensive periods. I would say harvest in particular. And when we look at, injury surveillance, we see that people tend to get injured during those busier months as well. Partly because they're interacting with all that equipment, and that's a risky thing to do. There are also links to fatigue. If you've got to get a crop out and the weather's about to change and you've got nothing, they've got lights on all the equipment now. People can go 24 hours a day, and that sort of fatigue, that it's like driving a car all day. You get that kind of road fatigue. The same idea happens if you're in a combine all day. So yeah.
So is there a season where there's more injuries than another season?
Usually fall, at least in the Midwest. So I should say that most of my knowledge is on Midwestern. I can't speak so much for like California, the Florida, the produce stuff, which I expect has a different rhythm. But definitely in the Midwest, the harvest, those fall months are the more, you see higher rates though there.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they're getting out equipment that they haven't used for a while. So you harvest something once a year. So whatever your implement is, you don't use it every day. So it's something that's a little bit unfamiliar. You're interacting with bigger equipment. You're maybe moving quicker. You're tired because you're overworking. And there's just more work to be done. It's sort of like the longer your workday is, the more time you have to be injured. So I think there are a lot of reasons why the fall is a risky time. Yes, ma'am.
What are some of the greatest health hazards that face the immigrants you've worked with?
Or maybe to begin with, have you done much?
Oh, yes, sure.
specifically
Sorry, I was
for
kind of
immigrants or
assuming.
migrant labor?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, not directly, but I can sort of speak just from a general public health perspective about what we know. And so at least here we have a couple of pockets of what I'll just sort of call immigrant labor. So there are populations who are settled, who are working particularly in food processing, so meat processing. That's another kind of area that sometimes gets left out of agriculture. I tend to be inclusive. I think it's a piece of the whole food chain. That's kind of a
Part of our class.
It's
for
part
sure.
of, yeah, it's definitely
Yeah.
part of how something gets to your table. So that population, they tend to be settled. They're not moving around like seasonal farm workers are. But they're also working in incredibly risky occupations. So repetitive motion injuries, cuts, falls, meat. I don't know if you've ever been in the big meat processing plant, but the temperature changes drastically from the beginning of the chain to the end of it. It's slippery. People are doing the same cuts over and over. So you see a lot of carpal tunnel and that kind of thing. People cutting themselves with the knives that they use. And then also just sort of the quality of the work tends to be pretty low. So there are also issues with harassment and a disempowered workforce that can't always speak for itself. So there's a whole host of challenges that go with that population. With the migrant and seasonal farm worker population in Iowa, we have I think there's somebody who was here last week or a couple weeks ago.
Rosa.
Yeah. So we've got some fruit production and some produce production where we're actually, you see crews of people coming through to harvest, say, melons in the southeast part of the state, that kind of thing. We also have people doing detasseling. So some of the big research farms, Monsanto, there's a big Monsanto farm near Williamsburg. They hire migrant seasonal farm workers to detassel and to work on those research farms. So those issues are a little different. People are working in the heat. They're working around chemicals, so pesticide exposures are an issue. But they also kind of have the same structure that they're a really disempowered workforce. So they don't have a lot of control over their day-to-day work. They're often separated from their families. There's a lot of psychosocial stress, and just the process of immigration is really challenging. And so you have, I worry about their mental health and their general well-being, sort of for both. So there's a lot going on with that population overall.
If these farmers are using very harmful chemicals, then why do they have people standing right nearby, like, all the time before, like, they go out to work? Like, they don't, like, tell them to, like, stand back farther than they,
It's a great question. They should. And so the rule with chemicals is you follow the label instructions. You're actually legally obligated to follow the label instructions. And so the label will tell you for what is the restricted entry interval. So if I spray something, like if I spray it with Roundup, I think the re-entry interval, REI, is 4 hours. So according to the EPA and the powers that be, that 4 hours after I spray something with glyphosate, you should be safe to go in it. There are other things, a lot of insecticides in particular, that it's more like 24 or 48 hours. These things are highly toxic. They're made to kill things, right? They kill bugs. They're made to kill things. And in the scheme of things, our systems actually aren't that different from some of those bugs that they want to kill. So the insecticides in particular are really risky. And yeah, you're supposed to have buffer zones are, you bring up an interesting point, which is you stand back from the actual spray area, and that varies based on the chemical, whether there's like a determined buffer between where you're spraying and sort of who might come in contact with it. There's always a re-entry interval that people should be attending to, and if they don't, they're legally obligated to follow the letter of the container. But there's a lot of spraying that happens that just on family farms where people kind of do their own thing, and it's hard to keep track of them.
Right, you're going off the story that Rosa told us about, like when she was little, which would have been in like the 80s, but where like they were picking tomatoes or something like that, and like they like sprayed them, and then they were like, okay, go on back.
Yeah. It's so frustrating to hear those things happen.
She also talked about how you move sticks and
And we have issues here. I would say the drift issues here are often from aerial sprayers. So the guys in the plains usually spraying fungicide. A lot of corn and soybeans get fungicide in July. And I know lots of farmers who have issues with the sprayers who are usually contracted by somebody else. So it's not like it's the farmer spraying, it's somebody who's contracted to spray. They're legally obligated to see if there are bees in the area, for example, if there are any specialty crops that might be vulnerable to spray. And if they don't, or if they're spraying at a time when the wind is too high, so again, your label will say don't spray when the wind is over, so much. And if they do, there could be legal action against them. But it means if I get sprayed on, I got to call the Department of Ag, or I got to call the Department of Public Health. I got to track down who might come out and investigate. It's sort of a complicated process to get follow up. So a lot of people just let it go.
We have some like farmer friends up near Tripola, Iowa.
Okay.
Rob and Tammy
Oh, yeah,
Fox, they got their, certified organic, big chunk of their certified organic CSA farm aerially sprayed. And, they're just like, okay, I guess we're not certified organic for 3 years, and that's like taking a bunch of money away from us and blah, blah, blah.
Right. It's not, if you're certified, it's not just that you lose your, hey Dana, it's not just that you lose your, your crop for the year, which you might, but then you lose your certification, so you can't be organic for 3 years, which is a real economic hit.
Okay, so if someone an immigrant or a migrant gets hurt on the job, and they have to take them to the hospital or call the hospital or something to come get them, wouldn't that person get deported?
That's a good question. And I don't know that I know the precise answer, because I think it probably depends upon where you are. I do know we had a graduate student do some research on what kind of sort of healthcare seeking behaviors migrant and seasonal farm workers engage in. So who were trusted healthcare providers. And there was definitely a sense that they would exercise caution. If they felt they had a medical issue, they would be very careful about who they might go see. I don't know what the regulations are for healthcare providers. I would like to think that we want to help people first, and it's sort of like the what is the term I'm using? The sanctuary city, where if you are having some sort of emergency and you need to call the authorities, that that your immigration status then won't be examined. I would like to think that's the case with healthcare, but I don't know for sure. Honestly.
That'd be a great question when we have
Yeah.
Denise come in next week.
Yeah.
Definitely know the answer to that.
What's your favorite part of your job right now?
Oh, good question. I was thinking as I was driving over here this morning, I was like, it's so nice to get out of Iowa City. So I like when I get to get out of Iowa City and go hang out on farms. I like interacting with students a lot. I really love teaching. I'm teaching a fun class called Agriculture and the Environment this semester, which is the first run of it. So it's like an experiment. I can run a class the first time. It's like, how is this going to go? So that I enjoy that a lot. And I like, I think, I don't feel a lot of desire to go be a farmer. I